I needed that for my recovery too. I feel like the desert has so many things that contribute to such a restorative healing. I think no matter at what stage of life you're in and whatever you're seeking, I think the desert is where you find yourself if you really allow yourself to be open to its healing properties and medicine.
Hi, and welcome to the Desert Lady Diaries podcast, 30-minute conversations with women who have found their home in the Mojave Desert. I'm Dawn Davis, and this is episode 136. There's more information about the podcast at the website, desertladydiaries.com. And to engage with guests, listeners, or me, follow and like Desert Lady Diaries on Instagram and Facebook.
Artemis J. Rose is a multiracial queer feminist who was born near LA and moved, albeit accidentally, to the desert over 2 years ago. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist, a woman's empowerment coach, yoga teacher, writer, and poet. Artemis is also finishing up her doctorate in clinical psychology with the intention of contributing to systemic change around trauma-informed care education. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm grateful to be here.
I'm grateful to have you here. Tell me about your first experience with desert.
I have two that come up. One, when I was probably around 5, visiting my godparents when they lived at the time in the Coachella Valley. And that was before they ended up moving back out to Mississippi, but they would come back to the Coachella Valley. And then I also have experience more in depth in Nevada, near around Las Vegas. Mm-hmm. I would go with my parents to go visit my stepbrother. And so I remember just what I loved about driving through it was the stars that I could look at, the quietness of it, the openness and the spaciousness of it. I loved that because it was so different from being around the city all the time. That was my first experience of the desert.
So talk about your experience coming and living in the Coachella Valley. It was Palm Desert, am I right?
Yeah, so it was, well, I lived in Desert Hot Springs, Palm Desert, and a little bit of Cathedral City. Yeah, so I landed in the desert unexpectedly. I didn't expect to end up in the desert, and I ended up living there for about 2.5 years. And I initially came to visit my godparents, and it was only going to be a couple weeks stay, but it didn't end up being a couple weeks stay. It ended up being 2.5 years. I won't go too much into detail because in case anybody's listening, I actually gave a talk all on this on my platform yesterday night. I landed in the desert as a reprieve, I guess, and a recovery from just prior facing a lot of loss in my life and ending up homeless. So I had everything. I had the career, the relationship, almost the dream house and all of that. And because of complex PTSD and trauma, I ended up losing it all. And I was running and living in different places. And the desert, prior to the desert, I was in LA. And so the desert was just going to be another stopping point for me because my godparents lived in the desert. So I figured, I'll go and visit them for 2 weeks and it will just be great. It will be a vacation and then I'll just leave. But it didn't work like that. I ended up coming to the desert, and then the desert immediately had a powerful effect on me because I felt safe. I think landing not only at my godparents, but also just the quietness of the desert. Because I had been living in the city life and the busy life and hopping around, and then landing in a place where it was quiet, it was open, it was spacious and safe, I got real about layers that I needed to peel back. And that's when I came out of denial about an eating disorder that I had developed coping with all of that. So that was my beginning landing point of the desert, it was this kind of safe haven that I just didn't expect at all for it to develop. The desert would become the main crux of my solid foundation within myself that I would rebuild like an authentic life.
I was going to say that it sounds like it maybe rescued you isn't the right term, but it sounds like you came to a space where you could actually hear the thoughts in your head and face yourself in the mirror and make some really life-changing and life-affirming decisions for yourself.
Totally. I think I had to come to the desert. So it was totally a life that brought me there, and I needed to be there. I needed to be away from the distractions and from the busyness and the chaos and the noise. And I did fall in love with the desert right when I arrived there. It's beautiful in the valley, just looking at all the mountains and just all the hiking trails. And I loved also the fact that it's such a tight-knit community because one of the things that I felt in other places that I lived was that it was really hard to feel like, oh, if I just go to the grocery store, I could probably run into somebody, right? But that was my experience in the desert. Like literally, I feel like I got to know so many people and plugged into so much of the community within a short amount of time. And I needed that for my recovery too. I feel like the desert has so many things that contribute to such a restorative healing. I think no matter at what stage of life you're in and whatever you're seeking, I think the desert is where you find yourself if you really allow yourself to be open to its healing properties and medicine.
Walk me through the realization after, I guess, 2 weeks, or was it sooner than 2 weeks,
Right.
staying with your godparents, that you realized I need to stay here and I need to do some things, and how that morphed into where you are now, because now you have left the desert.
Yeah.
So how did that all happen?
One day at my godparents, in one of the rooms, I was online and I was on Facebook, and then I saw this article about an eating disorder and I clicked it and I got curious. And meanwhile, in the room that I was in, my godmother had these themes of, those Mardi Gras masks. So she has decorative pieces. And the irony of that is that I feel like it represented to me the masks I was wearing, and then that's what I really feel like the desert really, the wilderness, right? I had to go through my wilderness experience, that the desert literally helped take off the masks. And so in that instance, I looked at the article and then I realized, oh my gosh, I have an eating disorder. Like it was crazy. It was as if like the veil of illusions just like fell off. And like I said, a huge reason is because I stopped running. I landed in the desert and I finally felt safe enough to feel and to not shut down from trauma or a pattern. And so that was my realization, oh, I need to get help. And I'll share a little bit of the story because it's so much irony, but I was like, okay, I need to stay here. So I surrendered. I was like, I need to get help. And I didn't know where I was going to go next, where I was going to live next, where I was going to go, because with my godparents, I didn't tell them. They only thought I was visiting for 2 weeks. Okay.
Right.
So and meanwhile, I had lost everything. I gave everything away. So I didn't own much. So I went to this local church and I met this young man and his family, and I just cried out to them for help. I was really desperate because I was so scared of ending up on the streets again, or I was so scared of just repeating another pattern. So he told me, he's like, let me take you to this woman's group. And now reflecting back, I can't believe I trusted him. Like I think about like some of it was totally like divine intervention. Like I was being looked after. So anyways, he dropped me off at this house where there was a women's group meeting, and I walked in and there were about 5, 6 women, and they were going around and saying their name and then saying that they were alcoholic. And I was like, why am I here? Like, I don't understand why I'm here. But then something told me I was desperate, and I was like, no, I need to sit my butt here and I need to listen because I'm desperate. And like I said, the desert helped me surrender, to not continue running away, but just to really do whatever it took to really,
Just
I
dig
don't know.
into whatever was happening.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. One of the women in the meeting at the end, she owned a sober living and she had an extra bed. And so I told her that I needed a place to live. So her and her husband, who are angels, they took me in. And mind you, I didn't have money to pay them. I hardly had any clothes. I hardly had anything, and they took me in. So for the first year in the desert, I stayed at the sober living, and I needed that because I think after having so much chaos that I had previously gone through outside of the desert, I needed that structure in order to feel safe enough to unravel more of just the layers and the masks. But it was really hard because my pride really wanted me to be like, I got this, or like, I don't need to be in a sober living. Like, I have to deal with an eating disorder, Not that I had addiction issues 10 years ago, but this point of my journey, it wasn't like I was an alcoholic or in that. But so I joined the 12 steps. I still was active in the 12 steps community because I worked my recovery all around. So not only was I working on my eating disorder, but I also worked the 12 steps around the AA, the NA, because that was a part of the condition and being in the house. So for the first year in the desert, I spent a lot of time there at the house alone and a lot of time outside in the desert, running and just walking and just being still in nature. But I would say that's like the desert in general. It's so easy to be still in the desert, So that was my first year. And then gradually after that first year, I would continue to build myself back up. and I tested for my license as an MFT. I got hired at a private practice working with eating disorders. And so I progressively, the second year, that's when I started getting more plugged into creative communities in the desert. The desert really helped me anchor this foundation into who I actually was. Like I felt like I was rebuilding from a solid foundation. And that's why I believe my life had crumbled previously, because I never had a solid foundation in myself. It was always, I was giving my power away, or my worth was always contingent off of either my career or a relationship, and all these highs and lows and all of that. But the desert, having to be staying put in the desert, now I understand why so many people come there also for recovery or even to retire. I get it. It's just so easy to find stillness, to find ease, and to find peace and oneness. The second year, I pretty much got plugged into the creative community. That's where I really started to step into my creative gifts of like spoken word. And so I started writing spoken word and performing, and I even hosted a radio show in the desert for about a year. I got really active in the nonprofit community. I got my nonprofit management certification. I was a part of the RAP Foundation. I did development with a nonprofit there, in addition to working at a practice in the desert for therapy. So I feel like for the short time that I was there, the amount of opportunities I was able to get to, I realized that was really advantageous in terms of building myself back up, because it was really easy to build relationships in the desert that I felt like I hadn't really experienced in other places, really. Maybe I never even gave myself that opportunity, but there was something still about the desert where it had that home feeling, where it was just easy to get plugged in. And I loved how so many different communities and different sectors just all blended in. So even if I was working in the nonprofit sectors, I would still find people in maybe like the art sector, or if not the art sector, then maybe the therapy. It was just so much blending.
Mm-hmm.
That was like my second year. It was a lot more grieving and bawling my eyes out, but I got more solid in myself. And then the last half of the 2.5 years, I ended up moving into my own place and just continuing to build that foundation within myself. I was planning to get a house in the desert. I had surrendered that I was just going to live there.
Mm-hmm.
I had to surrender because a part of me, like, I'm a city girl. That's just how I am. And like when I would go in the desert, people would be like, you don't look like you're from here. You don't look like you're from here. And I'm like, yeah, no, I'm like more of a New York, or, well, eventually one day I'd like to end up in New York. But I had surrendered to life because I knew my old ways. It got me in the mess that I was in.
Right.
So I realized that, okay, if I have to be here in the desert for 10 years, like, I'm okay with that. And the irony is, right when I actually was embracing that, that's when kind of life was like, okay, you've learned what you needed to learn here, and it's time to move forward. And that's also kind of when COVID happened. I feel like with COVID happening, it kind of sped up the process of just going within more and doing more of like that inner work. So I'm just so grateful for the desert. I mean, I feel like the desert is a huge reason why I am who I am today. And it's humbled me extremely. I think that's another thing that I express a lot to people about. I needed to be in the desert because I needed to be humbled. I needed to be emptied of myself, because prior, when I was from a place of service and I had all these good intentions, a lot of my efforts were still very ego driven. Like, even though I really wanted to be of service, it was just still this like need to feel like I mattered or that I'm seen, right? And the desert really helped me to peel back the layers to be seen within myself. And it's like that typical spiritual experience,
Right. Yeah. No, I feel the same thing. And when I came out here 4 years ago, I had this sense of I needed to be here, but I didn't know why. And I was just trusting that my instinct and the universe knew why. And sometimes with these things, we don't ever know if we'll get the answer. Sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. But for now, I'm here and doing what I'm doing, and I'll just keep doing that. But I
Yeah.
agree, you're right. It does the whole business about stripping the layers away. And I think that is why it's easy for people to connect in the desert, because they are probably their most authentic selves because of that, stripping away and giving themselves the opportunity to just think and be with their thoughts and recognize what's important to them and how they want to manage the rest of their life.
Yeah, definitely. I would wholeheartedly agree with that. And I just love too how at the desert it was like I knew how to make my way around the desert within a short amount of time. I'm like, wow, I know my way around Palm Springs. I know my way around Palm Desert. I know my
Mhm.
way around La Quinta. Like I feel smart. This is a joke, but I like that. It felt really good to feel like I knew my community. I knew my roots. And to be honest, I plan on still dropping by and visiting one more time before I make the move back up to Sacramento, because now some of the relationships that I've established in the desert are still going to be some of really crucial relationships that I take with me, and my godparents still live in the desert. So
Yeah.
I still want to frequently come back.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons that I was inclined to ask you to come on the podcast, for those people listening who I would like to give them a little backstory on how we met.
Yeah.
We actually met in the Coachella Valley Women's Business Center It's Your Time program, which is a female entrepreneurship program. It's like 13 weeks, was it, or something?
Yeah.
And we it started just about a month before the whole COVID shutdown happened, and then most of us ended up doing all of the classes that we needed to do online. But now we still meet once a week as a cohort, and for anybody who can make it, and talk. And you had mentioned that you were trying to create a business where people who don't typically have access
Mhm.
to mental health services would.
Mhm.
And I felt I wanted to talk to you about that and why that's important to you, and why it's important let those people have that access, or make sure that they have that access. So can you go into a little bit about why you came to the It's Your Time program? Because obviously you're going to start a business, and what is driving that to be in that kind of business.
Yeah, I appreciate you having an interest in that. So I was drawn to the It's Your Time program, which is an amazing program. I'm so grateful that it was offered, and it was something that since I landed in the desert, I saw the marketing like at one of the local Starbucks. It was so easy to find. That's another thing. I feel like it's easy to find events in the desert. But anyways,
Well, and there's something about the desert putting things in front of you that you need to see. And yeah,
totally. Yeah.
yeah.
So I knew I wanted to create a business prior to me falling hard and all of that. And it was supposed to be a woman's, well, it is. I've already launched it. It's Embody You. That I have two business in the making. So there's Embody You, which is a woman's empowerment coaching. I work with women and those identifying as women, very open to non-binary. It's trauma-centered coaching because I feel like a lot of coaching that's out there, so much is prevalent. I have my therapist background, so I feel like a lot of our mental health issues come down to trauma, unresolved trauma. And there's especially modalities out there called like somatic experiencing, interpersonal neurobiology, where it goes more into how unprocessed trauma can manifest as anxiety, depression, bipolar, like all these other conglomerations of what we usually typically see in mental health. And personally, because of everything I've navigated in my journey these past 10 years, wholeheartedly, I believe in how trauma impacts us. I dealt with complex PTSD my whole life, and it's manifested as anxiety, depression, ADHD, all these other mental health issues. As I peeled back the layers the past 10 years and processed so much trauma, I've seen the correlation between how much more I'm able to be in my body, because trauma really gets us in our heads. When we have a lot of unprocessed trauma, we're disconnected from our bodies. And if we're disconnected from our bodies, we're unable to feel. And if we're unable to feel, then we don't know what we need. And if we don't know what we need, then we don't know who we are and how to take care of ourselves and what we want and what we value out of life. So essentially, to me, I see our world as we're all walking around with trauma. And there's like big T trauma and there's little T trauma, but there still has big effects. You have big T trauma where it's okay, you have your physical abuse, right? Domestic violence, sexual assault, all of these. But then little T trauma is like developmental developmental trauma, which I think we all grow up in this world, so we've all experienced it, where you're not seen, you're not attuned to, you're not mirrored. So maybe if it's as simple as you go to school and you express your feeling, and then maybe you get shut down because the teacher's busy in the classroom, which can happen, right? But that could be a little T trauma, because maybe in that moment you're expressing a part of yourself, and when it's not seen or mirrored or integrated, then you learn to either dissociate or disconnect that part of yourself, right? And so with trauma too, I feel like it has us dissociate or disconnect parts of ourselves, and that essentially takes us away from our wholeness of learning to be fully in all of who we are. So tying it back to the mental health, this other business that I'm creating on the side is going to be teletherapy, because in my field they really recommend that I don't combine coaching and therapy in one business, because therapy has more regulations and laws, and coaching's more flexible. So my online platform is just the coaching, but I bring my therapist background. It's an advantage for people to work with me towards that. But on the back end with the private practice, I want to work and get on like Medi-Cal panels, because I feel like there's not as much quality care in Medi-Cal and specific in other insurance panels. And especially what's really awful is with Medicaid, even for like our elder communities, we're not approved to see MFTs. We're not approved by insurance panels to see our elders, which is BS. There's a lot of things that are just not right in terms of access to care. And that's one of the things I'm excited about going back up to Sacramento, because I'm really passionate about policy work. And before all of this went down, I was actually involved up north around that, like advocating for a lot of mental health type stuff. So going back to like Medi-Cal and stuff, being somebody who has personally struggled with poverty and homelessness, and I mean, you name it, I've gone through bankruptcy, poverty, homelessness, addiction, eating disorder, all forms of that. And actually just last year I came out and identifying as queer, and I realized that was a huge part of me and my trauma, which is why I was running, right? The desert actually helped me learn to integrate these parts of myself that I had really was running from. And the desert was such a safe place for me to come out, because I found really good community there to help me, especially when I was just in that vulnerable stage of like owning these parts of me. I found really awesome community that provided me that support that I needed and that cushion as I built myself up enough. Now today I can stand here and own it because I've done enough healing and integration. But with the Medi-Cal, being as somebody who was a recipient on it, one of the things that would frustrate me is just the barriers and the challenges to getting equal access quality care. And especially as someone having been in the field, I know what quality care is too. And the reality is there's a lot of therapists out there, and it's not that I'm trying to, because I know we're all like in our own journey and we're struggling, we're surviving, we're trying to do our best. If you find certain access to care, like at a higher paying practice or other certain insurance panels, the services aren't the same. And that's also because I feel like there's a lot more emphasis on behavioral, like the modalities used with county is more strictly like around behavioral, and it deals with symptoms and it doesn't get to the root of issues. And especially as someone being in the field, I see that. And so if anybody who's listening to this who's in the desert, I used to work at Desert Marriage and Family Counseling, and I really enjoyed working there because they represented pretty much, you walk in there and you immediately feel at home. And the quality, you could just feel the energy. It's a soulful energy, and it's a community, and you feel like you're valued, and the quality of care that you're getting is amazing. And that's also because the director who works there, she really does care. She cared about her therapist there, and she cared about everybody that walked through those doors. And I helped teach yoga there. We integrated a lot of holistic care for a lot of the clients who even had Medi-Cal. And even with some of the clients who didn't have insurance, if they walked through those doors, we would still make sure that we would help them through that process. And I feel like that's something really hard to find. And not just that, after you finish certain therapy groups too, typically what I find with clients is that they need community still. Like they feel like if they finish a therapy group, it's hard for them to then go back out into maybe their friendships or wherever, right? Because it's like on your path to your authentic self, you're also peeling back the layers where like certain groups or communities don't resonate with you anymore, and you start to feel really lonely, right? And so one of the cool things at Desert Marriage and Family Counseling is that there's alumni support groups. So if you did the anxiety or depression group and you finished that, then you could still come back every week and plug into that and still be plugged into the community. And so I really liked that because it was really all around wraparound integrative care. And the modalities, like I said, that were used are like still evidence-based, but like still quality care. So that's kind of my practice that I'm starting also on the side, is that creating where I'm able to help those with least access, or who have Medi-Cal, and being able to provide them more of these services, or especially individuals who want to go deeper. Because the thing is some clients, they don't want to go deeper, and that's okay. We're all at different stages of our growth. We're all trying to just survive in this world. But for those who are probably similar to me, where it's like I was a student and I was in debt, so like I couldn't really go and get a higher paying job, or I had an internship, I still wanted like I wanted to go deeper. I didn't want to, just like scratch on the surface. And so that's really the work that I'm doing, that I'm actually setting up in my own counseling practice on the side. And with COVID going on, I'll be offering teletherapy. So if anybody's still like in the desert and you're interested, that's still an option of working with me if you didn't want to work with me with the coaching practice. But if anything, I would highly recommend, there's always Desert Marriage in Palm Desert. That's a really awesome community to be a part of.
Well, and I'll make sure that I put that in the show notes. And I also want to put in your coaching website. So why don't you go ahead and give that to us again?
It's Embody, so EMBODY, and then the letter U, and then coaching.com.
Thank you so much for coming today and talking about that. I think it's something that's really important and necessary, especially in the times that we are now, for people of little resources to be able to find some quality care. So thank you for mentioning Desert Family and for creating your own space as you move forward for vulnerable communities who need that. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to speak about it. I mean, there's resources out there, and anybody who's listening, you're not alone, and there's help and support out there. We need help and support, and there are resources in the desert. You'll be able to find what you're seeking in terms of services out there.
Excellent. Before I let you go,
yeah,
we're going to do the Diary Unlocked questions. And I'm going to make that noise that those chips make when they roll around the jar. And I'm going to just throw 2 out and see what comes up. So if you're listening and you want to hear Artemis's answers to these questions, go to desertladydiaries.com, click on the support page, and select the Patreon option. You will have access to Diary Unlocked episodes from the beginning, I think January of, gosh, is it already a year I've been doing this? I don't even know, but there's a lot of them out there. The questions that Artemis will be answering are, what is your favorite driving or road trip music? Since coming to the desert, what have you been surprised to discover about yourself? That's interesting, given the conversation we just had. What's your favorite fairy tale or childhood book? And what is something people would be surprised to learn about you? So if you want to hear Artemis's answers to those questions, go to desertladydiaries.com, click on the support page, and sign up to be a patron of the Desert Lady Diaries podcast. Artemis J. Rose, thank you so much again for being here today. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to everybody who's listening.
In the Diary Unlocked portion of the podcast, Artemis mentioned an upcoming event that might be of interest to some of you. Prior to being interviewed here, Artemis was interviewed on the podcast Let's Talk About Race, hosted by Diane Wong. Artemis is part of the Racial Justice Collaborative and their efforts in moving the conversation forward. The collaborative is hosting a race retreat on September 26, 2020, from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. If you're interested in more information about the retreat or securing a donation-based ticket, go to desertladydiaries.com, which will have a synopsis of this episode, a photo of Artemis, a link to the collaborative's website, and the link to get your ticket to the event. I tried to locate a website for Diane's podcast, but it seems the easiest way to locate it is to do a Google search for Diane Wong, DianeWong. Let's talk about race. And of course, I have shout outs today to, I think it's Margie S. or Marge S. Thank you. Judith B. and Jennifer W., who each signed up for the new episode newsletter. Thank you all. I appreciate you. And a shout out to listener Jessica G., who stopped into Soul Connection on Sunday with her husband. It was great to meet you both. Thanks so much for coming in, introducing yourselves, and for listening to the podcast. This podcast is funded through the generosity of listeners like you. If you'd like to learn how you can chip in, visit the website desertladydiaries.com and click on the support page. Thanks so much for listening.